What if I told you that one of the most effective fighter bombers of World War II was built almost entirely out of plywood and glue, yet had a loss rate of under 1% and frustrated the Germans so much that, when they couldn't destroy it, they actually tried to copy it? You'd be right to doubt such a claim, but as the story of the de Havilland Mosquito reveals, it's completely true. The missions this wooden aircraft flew were some of the boldest and most astonishing of the entire war. It all began in the early years of World War II, when every nation was trying inventive ways to gain the upper hand. Among the heavy metal bombers being torn apart in combat, one man, Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, proposed a radical idea: build a bomber entirely out of wood, unarmed, and capable of defending itself purely through speed. The British government wasn't convinced. At a time when modern aircraft were all metal, such a proposal seemed absurd. But de Havilland pressed on, using his own factories and resources to make it real. His reasoning was both practical and brilliant. Britain was running short on metals. Everything from pots and gates to iron railings was being melted for the war effort, and wood was abundant, lightweight, and easy to shape. It could also be produced quickly, and, in a strange bonus, it floated if the plane went down over water, which was often the case on missions over Europe. Despite ridicule from skeptics, de Havilland, backed by Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman, refused to give up. The prototype, secretly built near London from Canadian birch and Ecuadorian balsa, took shape with the help of Britain's finest craftsmen. Even furniture and piano makers joined in. After many setbacks and repeated orders to cancel, the Mosquito finally took flight on November 25, 1940. To the disbelief of its critics, it was incredibly fast, so fast, in fact, that it outpaced the Spitfire MiG-V, Britain's top fighter of the time. What began as a wooden folly soon earned a new name, the Wooden Wonder. Unlike most aircraft of its era, which were built with aluminum and steel, the Mosquito's airframe was almost entirely composed of spruce plywood and light balsa wood, bonded together with glue in a layered sandwich design. Its smooth, rivet-free skin reduced drag and allowed the aircraft to cut through the air with astonishing efficiency. The design also made production easier. No heavy machinery or welding required, so furniture factories and workshops across Britain could contribute. At its peak, one Mosquito was completed every single day, powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same legendary engines used in Spitfires and Lancaster bombers. It produced a combined output of 3,000 horsepower and could reach speeds over 400 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest aircraft of the entire war. Even more remarkable, it could carry a bomb load of 2,000 pounds on long missions and up to 4,000 pounds on shorter ones. The same massive Cookie blast bomb that required a 4-engine Lancaster could also be delivered by the Mosquito's 2-man crew. In short, this lightweight wooden plane could strike with nearly the same power as the mighty B-17 Flying Fortress, which needed 10 men, 13 machine guns, and a full escort just to survive a mission. But this was only the beginning of what the Mosquito could do. De Havilland soon adapted it into multiple versions: reconnaissance planes, night fighters, and deadly fighter bombers. The latter carried a fearsome nose-mounted arsenal, 4 20mm Hispano cannons, and 4 .303 Browning machine guns, all firing directly forward. Unlike most aircraft that had wing-mounted guns angled to converge at a specific point, the Mosquito's concentrated firepower struck straight ahead, giving pilots pinpoint accuracy and devastating fire density. Even with all this added weaponry, its speed dropped by only about 10 to 15 miles per hour. In combat, this meant the Mosquito could unleash over 1,000 cannon rounds and 5,000 machine gun rounds per minute, an overwhelming torrent of fire, described by pilots as like a fire hose of metal, could rip apart trains, trucks, airfields, and ships with terrifying efficiency. And the best part? It didn't need armor because nothing could catch it. Whenever the enemy appeared, the Mosquito didn't linger to fight, it simply accelerated and vanished. You might wonder if this wooden aircraft ever engaged in dogfights. The answer is yes, though far less frequently than purpose-built fighters like the Spitfire or the later American P-51 Mustang. Most of its aerial duels happened at night, often when one side caught the other by surprise. Still, since the Mosquito was made of wood, its pilots generally avoided head-on dogfights unless they had the advantage, usually ambushing the enemy during takeoff, landing, or from an unexpected direction. What made the Mosquito remarkable was how no other aircraft could match its balance of speed, power, and versatility. When it entered service in mid-1941, it first flew unarmed reconnaissance missions, mapping enemy positions from high above Nazi-occupied Europe. Painted in a pale blue that blended into the sky, the Mosquito mark, I prowled silently across hostile territory, capturing critical photos while remaining almost invisible to enemy eyes. If spotted, it would simply outrun pursuit and return home. These missions provided intelligence that directly guided Allied bombing raids on crucial German targets, causing the enemy endless frustration. Yet reconnaissance was only the beginning. Once larger numbers of Mosquitoes entered service, they completely changed how the Royal Air Force fought its air war. Until then, British commanders avoided daylight bombing, leaving that deadly gamble to the Americans, whose bombers were shredded in daylight raids by flak and fighters despite their heavy guns and armor. But the Mosquito was no ordinary aircraft. It was fast, precise, and agile. RAF crews began testing low-level daylight attacks, flying just above the treetops under German radar, delivering pinpoint strikes on vital enemy sites. What began as a risky experiment soon became one of the war's most effective tactics. Two men in a strange wooden aircraft were doing more damage than entire formations of heavy bombers. In September 1942, 4 Mosquitoes flew a daring long-range mission over the North Sea to strike Gestapo headquarters in Norway. They skimmed the waves, hit the target with deadly precision, and returned home losing only 1 aircraft. The raid's success stunned the Germans and electrified the British public when news of the wooden bomber finally broke. Once dismissed as a ridiculous idea, the Mosquito was now celebrated as the Timber of Terror, a symbol of British ingenuity and defiance. Its sheer speed proved to be the best armor imaginable. During one raid over France, a formation of Mosquitoes was intercepted by Germany's newest and deadliest fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190, a plane feared by Spitfire pilots and known as the Butcher Bird, armed with a massive BMW radial engine. The 190 could outpace most Allied aircraft, but not the Mosquito. When the German fighters swooped in, the wooden bombers simply opened their throttles and vanished into the distance, escaping with barely a scratch. Encounters like this became legendary. The Germans were infuriated, their aces powerless against an unarmed bomber that could simply leave the fight whenever it wanted. The Mosquito's reputation soared, and its pilots became heroes within the RAF as the aircraft took on more dangerous and symbolic missions like bombing Berlin itself in broad daylight. By early 1943, the German capital had endured occasional nuisance raids, but no one expected the Mosquito to strike at the very heart of Nazi power. The RAF deliberately chose January 30, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, for the attack, turning the Nazi celebration into a day of humiliation. As the wooden bombers roared toward Berlin under the midday sun, they weren't just carrying explosives, they carried a message. No city, no leader, and no fortress was beyond the reach of the wooden wonder. Berlin was supposed to host a grand celebration that day, an elaborate broadcast event marking the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. Radio programs were scheduled, speeches were being prepared, and the top Nazi officials, including propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, were ready to deliver their pompous addresses. As the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, stood poised to begin his speech at Berlin's main broadcasting house, the wail of air raid sirens suddenly tore through the air. Air raid sirens in broad daylight, in the heart of the Reich's capital. Moments later, a formation of 3 Mosquitoes swept in low over the city, attacking the radio station precisely at 11 o'clock a.m., the exact moment Göring was supposed to start speaking. The wooden bombers dropped their 500-pound bombs with precision, shocking the Germans, who couldn't believe that such an audacious raid was even possible. Göring survived, but his pride did not. He was reportedly furious and humiliated, especially since he had personally boasted that Berlin would never be bombed by enemy aircraft. To make matters worse, later that same day, as Goebbels prepared to give his own speech, another group of mosquitoes repeated the attack, forcing him to scramble for cover. Once again, one aircraft was lost, but the mission succeeded brilliantly. Though the raids caused little physical damage, the psychological and propaganda impact was immense. The headlines the next morning proclaimed how just 6 wooden planes had crashed the Nazi Party's grand celebration, humiliating the German leadership before the entire world. From that day forward, the Mosquito became a legend feared, respected, and admired. It kept up its relentless harassment, targeting high-value German positions with surgical precision. A few mosquitoes could destroy a specific building without the massive civilian losses that accompanied traditional bombing raids, whose accuracy was so poor that more than half their bombs missed entirely. And this wooden marvel wasn't done showing what it could do. Some versions were outfitted for night fighting, carrying radar and heavy cannons to perform daring intruder missions, waiting silently above German airfields for enemy bombers to return, then striking just as they were about to land, when they were most vulnerable. These nocturnal ambushes devastated the Luftwaffe's night operations. Other mosquitoes specialized in anti-shipping missions over the North Sea, terrorizing German convoys with rocket attacks. Each could carry 8 underwing rockets, enough to cripple any vessel unlucky enough to be spotted, and some were equipped to drop 500-pound depth charges on U-boats. One of the most extraordinary variants was the Tsetse Mosquito, fitted with a massive 57mm Mollins gun, a weapon powerful enough to punch clean through a submarine's hull with a single shot. But even that wasn't the aircraft's most surprising role. The Mosquito could also carry urgent cargo or even passengers in its bomb bay. The famous physicist Niels Bohr was smuggled to safety from occupied Denmark this way. During the flight, he lost consciousness due to a faulty oxygen mask, but the pilot noticed in time and descended to save him. The once mocked wooden aircraft had now become the Swiss Army knife of allied aviation, fast, flexible, and capable of doing almost anything. It even carried out daring rescue missions. In February 1944, during Operation Jericho, 18 Mosquitoes, escorted by Typhoon fighters, launched a low-level raid on Amiens prison in occupied France, where captured resistance fighters awaited execution. Despite terrible weather, the Mosquitoes flew in at treetop height, bombing the prison walls and guard barracks with pinpoint precision. Amid the chaos, hundreds of prisoners made a break for freedom, and 79 successfully escaped. 2 Mosquitoes were lost, but the mission's success was immortalized by onboard footage later used in British propaganda films. Of course, the Germans were desperate to counter these unstoppable wooden aircraft, but every measure they tried failed. The Mosquito was simply too fast, too agile, and too versatile. The only real danger came when German fighters managed to intercept one, a rare feat that required perfect timing, altitude advantage, and a steep dive to even catch up. Most Mosquitoes that were lost fell victim to anti-aircraft flak rather than enemy planes. Even when Germany developed its revolutionary jet fighters, the challenge remained the same: catching a Mosquito before it disappeared back into the clouds. By mid-1944, Germany had developed its first jet fighters, the Me-163 Comet and the Me-262 turbojet, both capable of easily outrunning the Mosquito and finally posing a genuine threat. However, this advantage came with a major drawback: there were too few of them. The Luftwaffe couldn't cover every front at once, and sending these rare jets to chase Mosquitoes only strained their already overstretched resources further, tying down their best pilots and aircraft. Despite their frustration, German Air Command couldn't help but admire the Mosquito's design. In fact, they tried to copy it. Kurt Tank, the famed designer of the Focke-Wulf 190, was tasked with creating Germany's own wooden twin-engine marvel. The result was the Focke-Wulf 154 Mosquito, a plywood-built fighter bonded with special glue and almost direct imitation of the British original. Yet the project collapsed after Allied bombers conveniently destroyed the glue factory, forcing engineers to use an inferior adhesive that caused a prototype to disintegrate mid-flight, killing its test pilot. Only a handful of FW-150 for seconds were completed, and they proved useless in combat. Desperate for a solution, German engineers even modified their Bf-109 seconds and FW-190 seconds with nitrous oxide boost systems to gain bursts of speed for high-altitude intercepts, and created specialized night fighters to hunt mosquitoes. None of these efforts truly worked. By late 1944, Luftwaffe officers reluctantly admitted there was almost nothing that could be done against the wooden wonders. Still, historians today often wonder why such an incredible aircraft wasn't built in even greater numbers or used more extensively. Despite its brilliance, the Mosquito was never meant to win the war alone. Bomber Command preferred massive four-engine heavies like the Lancaster, capable of carrying huge bomb loads on nightly missions, while the Mosquito didn't quite fit that strategic doctrine. It also competed for the same Rolls-Royce Merlin engines used by Spitfires, Lancasters, and Mustangs, making large-scale production difficult. Its wooden construction saved precious metals but came with flaws. In hot or humid conditions, glue joints weakened and airframes warped, limiting its performance outside Europe. The Mosquito was best employed as a precision tool, fast, surgical, and ideal for daring, high-stakes missions. Every successful raid silenced critics and proved that brains could sometimes beat brute force, something nearly as satisfying as blowing up a Gestapo headquarters. After the war, the Mosquito continued flying for several years, though the era of piston engines, and especially wooden warplanes, was fading fast with the rise of jet technology. Between 1940 and 1950, nearly 8,000 Mosquitoes were built, many by furniture and piano manufacturers who turned their craftsmanship into wartime service. Its final combat mission came during the Malayan Emergency, striking communist guerrilla targets deep in the jungle, an appropriate final act for one of World War I's most versatile and underestimated aircraft.